Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Archival 101, Dealing with Suppliers of Archival Products. I'm Stephanie Lamson. On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and the Preservation Week Working Group, I'm happy to introduce this free webinar as part of ALA's Preservation Week. Many thanks to our sponsor of today's webinar, Gaylord. Our presenter today is Peter Verheyen, librarian at Syracuse University Library. After beginning as a work-study student in preservation at Johns Hopkins, Peter studied binding and conservation in Germany and Switzerland, and has since worked as a rare book conservator at several research libraries and in private practice. He established the Conservation Lab for the Treatment of Special Collections Materials at Syracuse University Library, where he is also past head of conservation and preservation. He's been teaching the ALCTS Fundamentals of Preservation online class since 2012. The Archival 101 presentation was originally developed for call center staff at Gaylord when Peter worked there as Archival Product Manager. It has since been presented regionally to a variety of audiences. So before we begin, a few quick notes on today's webinar. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Peter will do his best to answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of his presentation. Also, please note that today's presentation will be recorded and available at the ALCTS webinar website and on YouTube. You're also invited to use the Twitter back channel #ALCTSCE to interact with other participants during the webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenters in the question box on the screen. The presenter and host will not monitor Twitter during the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Peter. There may be a slight pause.
All right. Am I live? Good. Welcome to Archival 101, and my name is Peter Verheyen, and thank you for that introduction, Stephanie. I've been ready to show my screen there. Are we all set now? Good. This is Archival 101, working with suppliers of archival products, and as Stephanie pointed out, this presentation got its start when I was working at Gaylord for a year, and the call center staff needed training because there were a lot of questions coming in from people like you, and that's where it had its genesis, and it's been developed and tweaked over the years and given numerous occasions. And so we'll get started. Stephanie, thank you for that fabulous introduction, and we'll skip over this slide, and that's me. That's my introduction for posterity. And so the first question is, what is archival? What does it mean? And archival in many senses has become a buzzword, just like sustainability and green. That doesn't mean it's bad, and I'm not saying that in a cynical sense, but it is a marketing term in many respects. It's something that's not really easily quantifiable. In terms of measuring it, you can say we have this paper, it's a pH 8.5, but what does that mean in terms of how long it's going to last? There's a lot of things that will have an impact on that, and we'll talk about it. It can mean a lot of different things for different materials. If you're talking about books, structure, how they're put together, definitely has an impact on the archival nature of them. In terms of storing and treating things, it means that you're storing it in the best possible environment, and it implies long-term retention. So you're not necessarily going to apply this, you don't necessarily need to apply archival principles in terms of the materials to records that you're only going to keep for 5 years, or 7 years, like your taxes. But it is a marketing term in a lot of respects, and often misunderstood. And I'm just going to say that right now, and we hope to clear some of those things up. So what are some of the issues and problems with materials? One of the biggest is the environment. If you're storing things in your attic and you're in Arizona, or in your basement and you're in Mississippi and in the floodplain, what have you, too hot, too humid, those are going to be real problems. Storing things in containers that are, old fruit and vegetable boxes, liquor boxes. The corrugated board for those is not of a very high quality. It's going to deteriorate. The acids are going to migrate into your papers that you're storing inside. Handling. How careful are you? And we'll get into that a little bit later on, but do you wear gloves or don't you? Having a disaster plan can definitely have an impact on the long life of your materials. and it's something that relates to the materials that you're actually storing them in. And then again, the quality of the artifacts. Are they acidic, brittle, torn, or otherwise sensitive? One of the most basic solutions, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is proper storage in the proper materials. So we're talking about boxes, binders, folders, all those things that you see in your archival catalogs, whether it's Gaylord University products or another vendor. And they'll have a lot of information about those raw materials. There's also the proper environment, and that can include things like UV filters on the fluorescents. If you have small contained environments, you might want to put a desiccant in there to control the humidity. Those absorb moisture from the air and release it. You want to monitor your environment with hygrothermographs or data loggers. If they record things, you can use that information over time. If not, at least you can do a process check as you need to, especially in environments where you're worried. Repair and conservation is not something that we're necessarily going to touch on here, but are you using the right materials, the right glues, tapes for mending tears, paper, cloth, things like that. So when you're buying from an archival vendor, with very, very, very few exceptions, you can assume that everything is going to be acid-free. And in some cases, it's going to be buffered. And that's a more important distinction, because if you're putting in paper, office papers, manuscripts, newsprint, things like that, you want that paper to be buffered. If you're putting in photographs, especially older photographs, albumin prints, color photographs, silk or wool fabrics, you want to use something that's unbuffered. So it'll still have a neutral pH of 7, but it's not going to have that extra buffering in there that can cause those materials to change color over time. Any of these materials, when you buy them, if they say acid-free, they're going to be acid-free at the time of their manufacture. But if you take things like newspaper clippings that are very yellowed, brittle, those are acidic, and that acid is going to migrate from that clipping into the folder or the interleaving, and that's going to change the pH of that. It rarely seems to travel the other way. So expect that the pH of your storage materials is going to change over time. So the big question when I do the slide that always comes up is, does this mean I have to replace all my boxes on a regular schedule? And I don't know of any organization that does that can afford to do that. So even though the pH of the boxes and the folders within it may be dropping over time, your materials are still protected. They're protected from light, they're protected from dust, they're protected from handling when you're carrying those boxes around, and all those things, especially the mechanical kind of damage or the light damage, will do far more to harm your materials than being in a no longer perfect folder or box. But on the other hand, if you're really noticing that the box is falling apart for any number of reasons, it can be that the lid is starting to tear because it gets opened so often, or the folders are looking really ratty, definitely replace them. And but it's something that you want to manage, because if you have huge collections like we do at Syracuse University, we can't afford to change all of our boxes every 7-8 years or whatever it happens to be based on the materials that are in there. So in terms of the buffered and the unbuffered, buffered materials are going to be preferred for most everything, except, as I mentioned earlier, some photographs, especially color albumin prints, and some textiles like silk and wool. Those buffered materials are going to absorb the acids that are in the air, that are in dust, for a longer period of time than unbuffered materials. Again, that goes back to how often do you think you need to replace something. But as I mentioned, they are going to become acidic. And if you want, a good way to test it is, for example, with the pH testing pen that I'll show later on. That buffering gives the materials a higher pH to start out with, and what gives it that buffering capability is the calcium carbonate, basically marble, chalk kind of material that is in the paper. and that helps absorb and bind those acidic compounds in the paper. If it just says acid-free, it means that it was acid-free when it was made, and it's not going to have any of those bufferings. It's going to age. It might age at a slightly higher rate, but those things are really, really hard to measure, and they also depend an awful lot on the environment in which you're storing things. Lignin-free, that's another really big term that you'll see in there, and the lignin is a part of the plants that are used to make paper. Almost all the papers that we use in the preservation field, with the exception of handmade papers, are going to be made from ground-up trees. Rag paper, or that has, let's say, cotton in it, flax, things like that, are used for handmade papers. They're very expensive. You're not going to really, you'll find those used in rare book conservation, not so much for foldering papers in an archival collection. When you grind up those trees, if you're just making newsprint, you really don't care what's in it, and all that lignin is going to be in there. If you're making better papers, that lignin can be removed when the pulp is extracted chemically. And it's that lignin which is really responsible, A, for the aging, but also the yellowing of the papers. And so that's definitely not something that you want, but it's also not something that you're going to get in archival products. So lignin-free, when you're buying the things, the boxes and folders, you're going to find those in the blue-gray boards, the tan boards, the corrugated boards. There really isn't any lignin-containing material used. The tan boxes, when you look at them and compare, the only real difference is that the tan boxes are likely to cost a little bit more. At the same time, unbuffered boxes, at least at Gaylord and some of the other vendors, those are going to be, if it's unbuffered, you're really only going to find that in a tan box. I have yet to see the blue-gray board in just a regular unbuffered, and that's generally because those tan boxes are marketed more specifically for storing photographs. If you've just got black and white prints, there's no reason you can't use a blue-gray box for those. And for regular black and white prints, that can be a buffered box. You just don't want to use that for color photographs. Plastics that are another topic, and we all love to use plastics. You can see through them, and if you see acid-free in plastics, that's kind of a misnomer. Plastics don't absorb moisture from the humidity, so they can't really be acidic, but there are still things to watch out for. The safe plastics that we use are either mylar or polyester. Mylar is a trade name for polyester, and that's a clear, rigid film. It's stiff, and it's chemically inert. Polypropylene is like mylar. It's got a little bit more crinkle to it when you kind of hold it in your hands, but it's not quite as stiff, but it's equally transparent. And then there's polyethylene, which is a little milkier, and that's what you see here. These are generally polyethylene sleeves. You can see through it, but you're not going to have that same clear view that you would with mylar or with polypropylene. What you really, really need to watch out for, and you'll still find in your collections, are PVC sleeves and acetate. Acetate was used a lot for report binders. Sometimes people used it instead of polyester for encapsulation. It can cause real problems. This image on the right here, that's of PVC that's starting to break down. Summer's coming. Cars have PVCs in them. That kind of haze that you have on the inside of your windshield, that's off-gassing from the PVC. That can cause real problems to your photographs and anything else that you store in those enclosures. They can also become brittle and they'll break. Again, they're not really used anymore, but if you buy, let's say, sleeves for office products that don't say Archival on them in particular, you may still be getting some PVCs. So really look at that, and when in doubt, buy it from a real archival vendor. Newspaper is one of our favorite materials in collections, and we have an awful lot of it. Clipping files, bound journals, things like that. As I mentioned earlier, it's made from groundwood paper, very poor quality. When you start getting into the mechanization of paper making, and that was in the mid-1800s, they were experimenting. How can we extract this cellulose from these trees? What else do we need to add to it to make a sheet that we can print, a sheet that we can handle? And a lot of those materials were unstable. As a consequence, it breaks down very quickly and becomes very brittle. If the newsprint is in really good condition, you can deacidify it and store it in a buffered enclosure or sleeve. For deacidification solutions, there's several on the market. Bookkeeper is one of the most common. It's the one that I recommend. The other one is Wato, and the easiest way to use them is out of spray cans or pump spray bottles. Bookkeeper has that. The Wato only comes in aerosols, and because of the formulation, it had a tendency to clog fairly quickly, which makes it very frustrating. If you have it in the right environment, you use the bottles, and conservation labs will do that. That's not as much of a problem, but if you don't have that infrastructure, then I would definitely recommend the Bookkeeper. If materials are in poor condition, a deacidification spray is not going to make that paper less yellow. It's not going to make that paper less brittle. And what I recommend in those situations is to make a photocopy onto acid-free buffered paper, and then you can either keep that as your copy of record, or if you really want or need to keep the original, deacidify that original and put it in a sleeve. Mylar sleeve is good because it helps support the document, and that way you can still read it. You don't want to take it in and out because that will cause it to break and tear. Adhesives are another type of material that we buy a lot, and what we really want to get away from and not use anymore are just regular office supply, tapes, glue sticks, things like that, because they will cause problems to the material. The older tapes, those really nice brown stains you see like in the image on the left, that's caused by cross-linking, and those were all solvent-based adhesives. And those are very, very difficult to get out of your documents and require a trained conservator who has the setup to deal with solvents. So you'll find those in the collection. If you're lucky, they'll just fall off, which happens quite often. If you're unlucky, they'll still be attached and oozing, but you don't really want to get into it. What you do want to avoid into the future is using them, and if you're going to use tape, and this is, especially for something like a circulating collections repair program, the tape to use is Filmoplast, the P, which is the thinner one. It's a buffered paper that has an acrylic-based adhesive that doesn't discolor and ooze or do any of those bad things. Yes, it's tape. Yes, we definitely don't want to use this on special collections materials, but for some things in the circulating collections, it really helps extend their life. And even with the old tape, as a conservator, I was always very glad if I had all the pieces in place. Yes, the tape was there, but at least I didn't have any areas of loss. So it's always a trade-off. And for mending tears and circulating collections and the Filmoplast. There's also some repair tapes that you can see on the market that are polyester with an acrylic adhesive, and I really don't like those as much, especially if the materials are more brittle, because that polyester tape has a harder edge. It's a little bit thicker than the Filmoplast, and what happens is when you make that repair is stronger than the adjacent paper, especially if it's brittle. So you'll get another tear if you handle it and you're not careful right along the edge, and that thicker, harder tape just accentuates that difference. So the Filmoplast really, it's thinner, it's more flexible, you won't have as much breakage. But if things are really horrendously brittle, tape isn't going to solve the problem. And you'll want to look at something like replacing it with photocopy or digitizing it. For mounting objects in albums, use photo corners. You can also use it if you're mounting things on boards. When we do exhibits, very often we'll just use photo corners, or we'll make corner-like things out of Japanese paper. That way the objects can just come out. You're not attaching anything to them. The adhesives that are used are acrylic-based. They're safe. The materials that they're made of are polypropylene or polyester, or in some cases buffered paper. That's safe, and you can just take things in and out. In the the image on the left here, there's mounting strips that you can use, and those have a narrow strip of adhesive on them, and generally raised up a little bit, and then a wider piece of folder stock, and those are really great for holding larger objects onto mat boards in storage or in exhibits to help support them. As our collections grow, we're starting to see new materials get entered into them. We have laser printers and they're very similar to photocopies. It's the same kind of technology, but we also have inkjet. With the laser printer output, that pigment sits right on the surface of the paper. It's held together with a binder, and those are very fade resistant. It's a particle, but if you've got a paper that it doesn't bond too well to, they're going to abrade, they're going to crack, they're going to come off. In some cases, and you see this a lot with workshop handouts, when you go to a workshop and you get it in a binder with a clear sleeve, it can also stick, and that's sticking to the PVC of that binder. So laser printer has some disadvantages, but for the most part it's not going to fade. Photocopy, same thing. It depends a lot on the paper. Inkjet it's nice because you get color, but you've got different kinds of inks, the dye-based ones. The colors are going to fade over time, especially if they're exposed to a lot of light. And they can also be very water or moisture sensitive. So if you get a droplet of water on most inkjets that are dye-based, and those are going to be the cheaper inks, that being a relative term, you're going to get real bleeding, and it's going to be a problem. There are pigment-based archival inks for inkjet printers that are not as likely to fade or bleed. They're used for art prints, also called plissé, which sounds wonderfully pretentious. It's basically another term for inkjet prints. A lot of, you'll find them in galleries, places printing copies of artwork. For both, you can get a variety of inks. Some are going to be better than others. If you buy it in bulk, the cheaper inks, you may have more problems in the long term. If it's something that really, really matters to you, where you're making real reproductions of things, definitely use pigment-based archival inks for your printers. CDs and DVDs, they're not really that new, but we're going to be seeing them increasingly in our archival collections. In the old days, we were told that if you want to store something, make backups, put it on a gold CD. Never ever consider CDs or DVDs archival storage media. Even gold media can fail. We did a digitization project where we got the deliverables on gold CDs. When we upgraded our storage capabilities and our web hosting for that digital collection, we wanted to go back to those original images on the CDs, and we found that several of them, I forget what the exact number was, had been corrupted. They're starting to fail. They couldn't be read, so we had to rescan the actual items that we had. The other thing is the technology is changing really, really fast, and how many of us used to store things on zip or jazz disks? And at some point in time, those CDs or DVDs are just going to be coasters. There's all those different formats, they're going to become obsolete. What you want to do is store your data, your files, either on servers with regular backups if you have that kind of infrastructure, or on external hard drives. The price of those is coming down if you can get 2 of them. Most operating systems or backup software can mirror so that you always have 2 copies. If you schedule your backups on a regular basis, then what you want to do is take one of those drives somewhere else in case you have an accident or something. If you have media, old reel-to-reel tapes, cassettes, video, what you want to do with those is store them in a cool, dry environment, migrate them to digital if you can, or buy replacement copies. That's not always an option. But those technologies, it's going to be harder and harder to find the playback equipment for them, but also to maintain the playback equipment, especially if they get a lot of use. The other thing to worry about, lost my train of thought, sorry, had to cough. With digital, when you're migrating things, remember that once something is digital, it's buy now, pay forever. So you have to start thinking in that digital preservation mindset of migrating those file types, migrating it from one storage device to another. And you want to do that before those devices become obsolete. So how long do things last when we put them into archival storage materials? And I'll kind of exempt digital from that, but again, some of these same factors will have an impact. It really depends on the variables such as the chemistry of the artifact, what was the quality of the paper initially, or the other materials. What kind of environment are you storing it in? Is it hot and humid? Is it cool and dry, which is actually quite good? How much use do they get? If you have things that are heavily used, no matter how good the storage environment, you're going to start seeing mechanical damage, such as tears, creases, things like that, and that will impact the longevity and the value of those materials. Most archival papers are designed to last about 500 years under optimal conditions. A lot can happen in 500 years, and to help those materials reach that time, especially if they're original materials, you really want to use the best combinations of supplies and environment. With plastics, it's a little bit more straightforward, provided you have the right ones and they're inert. They'll last pretty close to forever, whatever that happens to be. But they're not going to age in the same way that paper would. One of the things that you will see in a lot of catalogs is a little symbol that says PAT, Photo Activity Test, on it, and that's a test that was developed at the Image Permanence Institute at Rochester Institute of Technology. And what it does is it tests the reactivity of materials, so tapes, papers, and things, to photographs. Photographs in a lot of respects are like canaries in a coal mine because they can be very sensitive to environment, to materials that come in contact with them. And these tests are performed on most paper, board, plastic materials. That test is usually requested by the manufacturer or the seller of them, and if you see that, it indicates that that material is safe for use with photographs and by extension with other things. But you still want to be a little careful with how you're selecting things. That symbol should be in the catalog if you're not sure, and certainly if you want to store your things with photographs, then you want to ask. So if you see something, there's no PAT next to it, it looks like it's really that product that will meet your needs, contact the vendor, ask, say, has this passed the PAT test? If they're not sure, then either they'll help you find something that will work, or you need to look for a different solution yourselves. But most of the paper materials will all fit that criteria, even if it's not indicated. But again, when in doubt, ask. Asking's free. Cost, and this is something that a lot of organizations are worried about. It used to be a lot of the smaller local historical societies were very worried about it. At this point, given the fiscal economics, even large research library collections are concerned about costs, and archival materials do cost more than cheaper materials that you might get in an office supply store. And a big question that comes up is, why are they so expensive? And a lot of that comes down to the cost of the raw materials because they are a higher grade. Related to that is the fact that the archival market is a very, very small market for paper manufacturers. So you've got that niche. And the fact that it's made for a small group, the more vendors go towards archival supplies, it'll become a little bit less of that, and hopefully prices will go down a little bit, but you can never count on that. But that is a reason. I mean, these materials really are niche materials, and if you're storing things that are of value, you really want to be careful about the things that you're using to store them in. The other thing is that over time, archival products have become commodities, and between vendors, they're very undifferentiated for the most part. And that's because all these vendors, they're all working to the same set of specifications that were developed at Library of Congress or National Archives. So what you're going to see is that there's going to be visual differences in terms of some of them. If you look at, for example, the, I think it's called the Library of Congress line that Hollinger sells, that paper board is going to be a little bit rougher on the outside. It might not look as polished, as fancy. That material has the same chemical specifications as a very high-end box from another vendor. And so, that's where you really need to say what matters to me. If price is a really big indicator, you're not going to go wrong with the lower priced materials. But some vendors some vendors are better at some things than others, and what you'll also notice is that sizes between individual products may be slightly different, so definitely shop around. I know that having worked in the conservation field, sometimes your purchasing department will have contracts and things like that with either if it's through the state to get better pricing, what have you. But sometimes when you're needing to buy archival materials, if you explain to them that you really need these materials from vendor X because of the quality, because of the size, things like that, they're reasonable people, and you can usually bring them around. Another way that you can stretch your dollar, if you will, is by being flexible and creative. And a lot of the products that you'll see in the catalogs can be adapted for different things. An example that I like is using the slide photo pages, the polypropylene sleeves, for ephemera like buttons, campaign buttons, fun buttons like that. You can put clippings into photo pages rather than sticking them into an album. And if you want to give it a little bit more support, if you want to create a passive deacidification buffering system, put a piece of acid-free buffered paper behind it. For copy or printer papers, if you're doing that, most of those, because of changes, mostly in environmental regulation, are already buffered. And what I really recommend everybody getting is an Abbey pH pen. And on white paper, it's really easy to see. If you're using more brown cartons, even if they say that they're archival, that color contrast is a little harder to see, so it may seem a little bit more ambiguous. But when you put it down a piece of buffered paper, you'll get purple, and that'll tell you that that paper is buffered and is safe for use. And if it's yellow, then you know it's acidic or unbuffered. That line is kind of fuzzy, so use your judgment. Probably shouldn't say this, but sometimes I've done a project and I'll need copier paper, and I'll go to the office supply store with my pH pen. I'll open it up one end and I'll just run it down the back and check it. And you're finding fewer and fewer papers, copier papers, that are unbuffered or acidic, and that's a good thing. It brings down the prices. Glue and binders can be a real problem, and especially if you're looking at legacy collections, can be really problematic. They were really popular for storing pamphlets in library collections. This is an example from Syracuse. And what you've got is, you've got a binder, you've got the cloth, and on one side it sandwiches the board, and then in the center you stick your pamphlet in. And what happens is, like with the tape that we use, that adhesive that's on here, that gummed adhesive and that cloth become very stiff. When this paper becomes brittle and you open it, this is like a knife edge, and it's going to have a tendency to crack and tear right along that. So you definitely don't want to use these, but they can still be, if this is what you have, and the quality of the board of these, in most cases, especially if you buy the archival ones, is good, you can take a piece of you can fold a piece of, let's say, a good acid-free buffered 80-pound paper around a pamphlet, sew that in, and then stick that into the glue and binder part. That way, at least the original pamphlet is not in direct contact with it, and if you open it carefully, you can handle it a little bit more easily, a little bit more safely. Another way to do it, especially if you buy things in larger quantities, and if you have a board shear around, you can buy larger binders and cut them down, but you can make your own envelope binders and make them specific to the size of the materials that you need. You buy the envelopes in some stock sizes, 1 or 2 of those, the binders in the same, and you can just stick those envelopes right into that glue-in part. Or if you buy the ones that don't have the glue-in tab, which are greatly preferred, then what you can do is just cut your envelope to size, cut your binder to size, and then just use archival double-sided tape to stick that onto the back side. You can make, envelope slings by folding a piece of paper around the brittle material, leaving it longer when you put it into a sleeve, and that gives you something to pull it out on, and it also gives you something to push it back in with without putting stress on that piece of brittle paper. You still need to be careful, but it's a lot safer. One of the things that is wonderful is that these manufacturers are getting more and more modern technology. What you see on the left is an old die cutting machine, and you basically, if you take your archival box and you fold it flat, in most cases, especially with the barrier board, those will be die cut. It's an incredibly fast and cost-effective way of doing that. And a die is basically, it's a board with a really complex knife on it, or it'll have something that's dull and not quite as deep as a knife that's used for making creases. But they're also getting laser cutters and tables that have knives in them, and they can cut really complex shapes. That machine right over here, what that gives you is that gives you an incredible custom capability. And the vendors are all getting them, they're all using them. And if you've got objects that have really odd shapes, get a custom enclosure. The vendors can make this for you. Yes, the price is going to be different than a catalog item, but it'll ensure that you have a perfect fit to the object, which will help protect it better. And this really gives you a lot more flexibility. And if you have a collection with odd things, what you want to do is be proactive and just start asking for it right off the bat. And you'll find that in most cases the customer service people will be very happy to work with you. It's fun for them too to do something slightly different. Materials. If something, especially if it's, pretty much any box material, if it's made with one kind of board, it can be made with another. So if cost is an issue and you're looking at, let's say, drop front boxes, and you see a size that you really want, but you don't want to pay for the very expensive board, say, can we substitute the E-flute corrugated for this? In pretty much any collection storage scenario, that quality in material, that hard, let's say, blue-gray board versus the thin corrugated, you're not going to really find a lot of difference in longevity unless it's something that gets really, really heavily used and abused. So, as for substitutions, a lot of these products, they're regular, they don't have a lot of that in inventory unless it's a really big selling stock size. So it's going to end up being smaller runs for them, and make that a negotiation. Contact them, ask them, and it may well be worth your while. Again, they have the materials, they have the technologies. It's up to you to use them, and if they see that enough people are requesting something, they'll seriously think about possibly adding it to the catalog or something like that in the future. They're interested in your feedback as well. For more information, a lot of vendors have guides and things like that. Gaylord has a page for tips and guides, and one thing that they have that's really good is their Guide to Collections Care, paper, photographs, textiles, and books. It's a PDF at the bottom of the page that you can link to from here. They'll send you the handouts after the presentation. University Products has a page with resources, Hollinger Metal Edge. Pretty much everybody has tips. It's in their best interest to have an informed customer base. And then there's also other information that can be found online. If you're involved with preservation and you don't really have any formal training, the Fundamentals of Preservation class that ALCTS, who are presenting this webinar, they offer an online course for that, very highly recommended. Connecting to Collections has an online community with lots of webinars. Those are also free. New is Dear Danya, which is a kind of write-in Dear Abby kind of column that's done by Danya Khan, who's a very dear colleague of mine, and I know that she's going to have a lot of fun with this and that you're going to get really good information from her. The ALCTS preservation webinars and others are all archived. A lot of those, especially the free webinars, you can find on YouTube. It's a really good source of information. Northeast Document Conservation Center has probably one of the best collections of free leaflets and other materials like that online. Definitely familiarize yourself with all these things, consider them. And this leaves us about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If we can't get to them, then the friendly folks who are riding shotgun with me here will see that I get them, and I will answer them, and they will send it to all the attendees. But thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to answering some of your questions now.
Okay, so questions.
Where to start?
How about, could you please clarify whether all or just color photographs should be stored in unbuffered enclosures? And if you could address blueprints too, actually. Someone raised blueprints as well.
Very good question. If they're regular black and white prints, silver gelatin, if you can identify those on paper, fiber-based paper, those can go into buffered materials. If they are albumin prints, earlier photographic processes, I would err on the side of caution and use unbuffered materials, likewise with color photographs. One of the things that I've found and was confirmed by our local photo place here in town that we used to go to when we still used analog photographs is that there is no distinction made anymore between printing something black and white and printing in color. It all goes through the color process. And so, if I shot a roll of black and white film 10 years ago, I know that was probably printed color. I would probably put that into an unbuffered storage material. Blueprints and some other architectural drawing processes, absolutely unbuffered. The buffering can cause those images to fade.
Okay. Let's see. And could you just describe again the importance of buffered versus unbuffered again in terms of what makes something buffered versus unbuffered?
As part of the paper making process, when you're making a buffered paper, what you're adding is a calcium carbonate reserve. When we're working in conservation labs and we're making up deacidification solution, calcium carbonate in different forms is the essential ingredient in that. And what happens is that that calcium carbonate that's in the paper will help neutralize and bind those acids. It basically turns them into an inert salt. And it'll continue doing that until that alkaline reserve, as it's called, is used up. If you do a Google search and you look for milk of magnesia or something like that, you'll find a lot of homegrown recipes for making your own. I don't really recommend that because there's lots of other things in there, never mind the coloring, that can have a negative impact, but it's that same basic chemical process. But if you're dealing with newspaper clippings, manuscript materials, things like that, you definitely want to use the buffered because it just absorbs those acids that are in the paper that much longer.
Okay, another question. Would you recommend laminating documents to preserve them?
No. No and no. The lamination, lamination was one of those, maybe, when it was introduced, it was seen as kind of a gift to preserving documents, and we learned fairly quickly that the adhesives that are used, that the heats that's used can cause, I would just say across the board, irreversible, irreparable harm to the artifacts that are in there. We have examples in the conservation field of people who would use lamination to help preserve medieval manuscripts, papyrus fragments, things like that. And a conservator with the proper training, the proper solvents and things like that can try to undo those damages, but they're never going to be able to do it 100%. And there will always be ongoing concerns. If you want to protect something, what you want to do is you want to encapsulate it. And you can use polyester film for that, mylar sleeves. If they're open at the top, that's okay. You don't really have to take it in and out if you're worried about it. And you can either, the old archival, using the archival, the 3M415, double-sided tape for encapsulation. There are people who still do that, provided you leave yourself enough of a gap so that that object, even if it shifts a little, doesn't come in contact with the tape. That's one way to close it off. Or if you've got a reasonable budget and a smaller preservation program, get yourself a heat sealer. And edge welders, that's what they're also called, and many of the archival vendors have those in their catalogs, and that's a really easy way of just sealing things in. But you want to use inert films. You don't want to have any kind of adhesive bond between the object and the film that you're storing. Lamination is a real big no-no. If you're putting facsimiles in and you want something to pass around, that's a different story, but for any kind of historical materials, anything that you are keeping in your collections, you do not want to use lamination ever.
Okay, there's a couple questions about slides and their storage. One person has a bunch that are stored in metal boxes. The other one has them in the old Kodak boxes for storing slides from the 50s and 60s, and they're both wondering if it's okay to store them in those materials.
The old metal boxes, those are usually, as long as there's no rust on there, they'll be okay. The old Kodak boxes should be okay if you can replace them with, unbuffered paperboard boxes, and I believe that's something I haven't looked into, but I believe vendors will have boxes for those. That's a better alternative. With slides, especially color slides, what you really want to do is keep them in a cool, drier environment, because that does help preserve them a lot longer. But some slides, and I believe it's Ektachrome, will, as they age, the colors will start to go a little wonky. And so, again, it's the materials, but it's also the environment in which you're storing them.
Okay. Thanks. There's another question about archival storage of vinyl records. Any
Mm.
recommendations there for sleeves?
The original sleeves should be, and for collectors things should be fine. It really, the paperboard that the external sleeves are made of is not the best in terms of its quality. They really weren't thinking archival then. I don't know if they are now, but you can, if you store them in, archival boxes, and vendors do have boxes for LPs, and if you have a fairly small collection, that's not a bad place. But you can also buy, I believe there are polyethylene sleeves or polypropylene sleeves or mylar sleeves to put those things in as well.
Yeah, I know I've seen some that are a combination, I think, of paper and polyethylene, if I'm remembering right.
Right. But the material itself is fairly stable. But, again, you don't want to put it in your hot attic in particular.
So another question, which I think will be true for lots of people. Can you comment on using commercial plastic tubs and bins like Rubbermaid for storing family papers and photos?
The plastics that are used for those are most often polypropylene, and that's not going to cause an off-gassing problem. What you want to do is you want to look for the symbol that is stamped into all those, and polypropylene, I believe, is PP, or LDPE is low-density polyethylene, but you want to look for that. One of the problems with storing valuable objects in those plastic bins is you're creating a microclimate. And if you have a flood, and people are worried about water damage, that can keep the water off. But if water gets in, they also don't dry out, so you can get mold growing. It really depends. I would probably prefer to store my things in paperboard boxes, on shelves, away from walls, especially exterior walls, in an environment that's cooler and drier. But in general, if the polypropylene boxes, they're not going to cause damage, but it's the environment and external factors, like if you had a flood, that would make me worry more.
Okay. Is it better to put photographs in paper or plastic enclosures, especially older photographs?
It depends on how much use they're going to get. And for me, I would probably err, especially if it's a collection that people look at, I would probably put them into clear, polyester or polypropylene sleeves, simply because you can look at them through it. You don't have to take them in and out. And mechanical damage can very often cause far more problems than the chemistry of them, especially if you've got a good storage environment.
Okay. Let's see. Lots of questions.
Oh, there's lots of good ones.
Yeah. Are buffered enclosures safe for color magazine journal articles printed within the last 10 to 15 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's because those are printed, with inks. It's also a question of the quality of the paper, and it'll just help extend that. But I'm, especially if you're talking modern publications, I don't know if anyone's actually done any testing of those, so we're kind of following our gut. It's the chemistry of photographs, blueprints, and things like that that's a lot different.
Okay. There's another one this one might be a little tough. Is there a difference between archival needs of digitally printed photos versus those printed in dark rooms?
The papers are going to be different. The processes are going to be different. In terms of storing them, if it's a digital print on a buffered paper, you really don't have control over that. But if you're worried about the inks that are used, then erring on the side of using an unbuffered I don't think will cause any problems. But it's a good question. There's a lot of technologies, a lot of processes that are popping up very, very quickly, and thinking about it as these questions are coming in, it's an opportunity for doing some research. And I know Image Permanence Institute does a lot, and they're a very good resource to contact. But I think it could also be, a good project for someone to take on and publish in the professional literature. I'm looking at the questions here, and I'm realizing I didn't really touch on it in the presentation, but gloves. My preference is no gloves. I would say clean, dry hands are very good. If you're dealing with, photographs, I may change my mind.
Yeah.
Depending on how you hold it, depending on who's doing the holding. But if you're dealing with things like newsprint, brittle papers, the gloves, you don't have the sensation, especially if they're cotton gloves. You don't have the same sensation that you do with your fingers. And if they're cotton gloves, the fibers very easily catch on the ragged edges of those papers, and you can get tears quicker than you think. So you're probably better off just having clean, dry hands to use for that. But a lot of places they say, well, we tell our patrons to put on gloves because that way they handle the materials more carefully. It's kind of instilling respect for the materials. But I think, and this is based on my experiences, based on what I've seen in places that I've worked, that you're better off not wearing them, especially if you've got newer materials with brittle papers and things like that.
How about how would you store stamp collections when they come on first issue cards?
Acid-free buffered materials.
Okay.
And for all these kinds of things, especially if they're collectibles, keeping them out of the light is really, really important. That can cause as much damage as anything in the way of fading in terms of accelerated aging of the materials. Even if it's behind UV filtering plexiglass, things are best off in the dark.
Okay. One person asked about what kind of photo corners or strips.
You want to use ones that are either polypropylene or polyester with an acrylic adhesive, and that's what you're going to get when you buy them from an archival supplier for the most part. Sometimes you can find them in photo stores and things like that, but if you're dealing with historical collections, I would err on the side of getting them from our archival vendors.
Okay. And another, can you store photos in a filing cabinet?
Sure, why not? Again, what you want to do is you want to have them properly folded, and that would mean if you're dealing with good quality silver gelatin black and white prints, nice buffered envelopes, or folders. If you're dealing with color and things like that, you want to put them into unbuffered folders. But you also want to think, storing things in boxes, depending on how they're going to be used by your staff and your patrons, it might be safer for carrying them if they're in an archival box than pulling folders out of filing cabinets. But I know that that's not always an option, depending on your situation.
Yeah. So another question about clamshell boxes versus flip-top document cases. Do you recommend one over the other?
No. It depends on
Material, right?
On how you want to use things as well. If your materials are all folded and they're in one of those flip-top document cases, you can see those folder headings very easily, and you can pull it out. If you've got a drop front box, then you can't browse it quite as easily because you'd have to essentially pull everything out or risk spilling it across the table. But if you're going to buy those flat boxes, definitely get the drop fronts because it's easier to get the materials out. The ones where you have the metal edging, or if they're ship flat boxes that you fold together, where all four sides are rigid, it's harder to get the materials out. And again, it comes down to trying to avoid as much mechanical damage through, care and handling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's all we have time for. So the other questions Peter will try to answer as he's able to later.
Yep.
So thanks, Peter. It was a great presentation. And
thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. And if you've got questions off list or something like that, my contact information is in the slides, and feel free to contact me.
Okay, thanks again, Peter.
You're very welcome.
And I hope you all can use some of that advice. I think he's given us great tips to make us smarter shoppers when we search for archival products. So for more information about preservation, please visit ALA's Preservation Week website, where you can find great tips and resources to help you preserve your family treasures. And thanks again to today's sponsor, Gaylord. We'd also like to thank our Preservation Week spokesperson, Steve Barry, for his support of preservation in ALA's Preservation Week. And last but not least, thanks to Eva Sorel for her technical assistance today. Archived ALCTS preservation webinars can be found on the ALCTS website and the ALCTS YouTube channel, and more information about upcoming webinars, web courses, and e-forms can be found on the ALCTS webinar website as well. We hope you found today's session helpful. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. Your comments help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee evaluate and plan future offerings. If you're interested in viewing parts of the presentation again or sharing it with others, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. The presentation will also be archived and freely available at the ALCTS webinar website and on YouTube. Thank you all again for joining us today. Goodbye.